I still wake up in the middle of the night, my body drenched in a cold sweat that soaks through the sheets and leaves me shivering under the covers. My heart racing as if I've just escaped some unseen predator lurking in the darkness. The memories of what happened in those remote woods 3 years ago, flooding back with such vivid intensity that it feels like I'm right there again, surrounded by towering trees that blot out the sky and a silence so profound it presses against my eardrums like a physical force. What we did out there wasn't just a reckless adventure or a hunting mishap born from overconfidence. It was a grave transgression against the natural order, an invasion into a domain where ancient secrets have been guarded for centuries by beings that defy our understanding of the world. And ever since that fateful trip, I've been plagued by the unshakable belief that we stirred something malevolent, a vengeful presence that has followed me back to civilization, manifesting in fleeting shadows at the edge of my vision, or the distant howls that echo through my dreams, reminding me that some things in the wilderness are better left undisturbed, their existence a warning to those foolish enough to seek them out. I'm only telling this story now because the nightmares have become too relentless to ignore, evolving from fragmented flashes of terror into full-blown recreations of the events, where I relive every scream, every gunshot, and every moment of gut-wrenching fear. And perhaps by putting it all into words, by sharing the unvarnished truth with anyone who will listen, one can finally find some semblance of peace, or at least warn others not to repeat our mistakes, not to venture into the deep forests with guns blazing and egos inflated, lest they invite the same curse upon themselves that has turned my life into a perpetual state of vigilance and regret. Back then, I wasn't what you'd call a dedicated hunter, someone who lived for the thrill of the chase or the satisfaction of a clean kill. My experience was limited to a few scattered trips, maybe 4 or 5 in all, each one a relatively tame affair during the standard hunting seasons, where we'd set up in familiar spots to bag deer grazing in open fields or ducks skimming over componds, the kind of outings where the biggest challenges were dealing with inclement weather or the occasional mechanical failure of gear. Never anything that pushed the boundaries of safety or invited the supernatural horrors that lurk in the untamed wilds beyond the reach of maps and civilization. My 3 buddies, on the other hand, were the real deal, lifelong enthusiasts who had cut their teeth on hunting from the time they could walk, learning from fathers and grandfathers the intricate arts of tracking elusive game through dense underbrush, reading the subtle signs left in mud and foliage, and handling firearms with the precision of surgeons, their knowledge so deep and instinctive that they seemed to blend seamlessly into the landscape, becoming part of the forest itself rather than intruders upon it. And they were always on a mission to draw me deeper into their world, to challenge my comfort zones and show me what true hunting entailed, dismissing my casual approach as mere dabbling that missed the profound connection between man and nature that only comes from facing its most formidable aspects. It was in that particular October, when the leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and orange under a sky that promised early frosts and crisp mornings, that they called me up with this grand plan, their voices buzzing with an excitement that hinted at something more than the usual weekend getaway, insisting that this was the trip where I'd finally learn the ropes of serious hunting, the kind that tested not just your aim but your resolve. And though I assumed they meant going after bigger game like elk roaming the high meadows or perhaps a bear foraging in the berry patches, something that would require real skill and preparation, I said yes without much thought, eager to strengthen our bonds and shake off the monotony that had crept into my previous hunts, little knowing that their idea of serious would lead us straight into the jaws of a nightmare from which only I would emerge, scarred in body and soul. We set out before the crack of dawn on a Thursday, the truck loaded to the brim with supplies for what they promised would be a week of immersion in the wild, rifles cleaned and sighted for accuracy at long ranges, boxes of ammunition stacked neatly by caliber, Camping gear, including tents rated for sub-zero temperatures and sleeping bags filled with down for insulation against the mountain chill. And enough food, canned goods, dried meats, energy bars to sustain an army through sieges of bad weather or unexpected delays. All of it packed with a meticulous care that spoke to their experience and hinted at the gravity of what lay ahead. Though at the time I chalked it up to their usual over-preparation. Right from the start, there was something off about their demeanor. A series of inside jokes that they shared with knowing smirks and laughter that died when I asked for explanations. Glances exchanged in the rearview mirror when they thought I wasn't paying attention, building an atmosphere of secrecy that made the drive feel like the prelude to some illicit operation rather than a simple hunting trip. The kind of tension that sets your nerves on edge without you quite knowing why. We drove north for 3 solid hours on the main highways, the road unfurling under our tires as the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the landscape in golden hues, before we turned off onto the logging roads that branched into the wilderness. Paths that started as smooth gravel but quickly deteriorated into a rugged mess of potholes and washouts from recent rains. The truck lurching and groaning as we engaged 4-wheel drive to plow through sections where the earth had been carved away by flash floods. Every bump and jolt amplifying the sense of venturing into forbidden territory, away from the safety of paved roads and cell signals. After another 2 hours of this punishing ride, we reached a gated barrier with a faded, rusted sign warning private logging company, no trespassing, a clear signal to turn back for most people. But one of my friends casually hopped out with a key in hand, unlocking it as if it were his own backyard gate. When I questioned how he had access to such a restricted area, he just grinned mysteriously and mentioned a cousin who worked for the company. A vague explanation that did little to ease my growing unease. But we drove through anyway, and he locked it behind us, the metallic click echoing like a finality, sealing us into a world where the rules of society no longer applied and the forest reigned supreme. The road beyond the gate was even worse, a tortured ribbon of deep ruts left by heavy machinery from years past, strewn with fallen branches that cracked under the tires like bones, and sections where we had to ford creek beds because the bridges had long since washed away in storms, the water rushing cold and swift against the vehicle, splashing up to wet our feet and fill the cab with the scent of wet earth and pine. As we passed by abandoned logging camps where rusted equipment sat like relics from a forgotten era, overgrown with vines and moss, and miles of dense forest that seemed to close in around us, the trees growing taller and more imposing with every turn, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun and cast everything in a perpetual gloom, building a suspense that made my stomach knot with anticipation of what awaited deeper in. Finally, after what felt like an endless ordeal of bouncing and swaying, the road simply ended in a small turnaround spot beside a babbling creek, beyond which lay nothing but unbroken wilderness. Our total drive clocking in at 6 hours that left us weary but excited, though the hiking portion still loomed ahead like a daunting challenge. As we hoisted our packs, each one weighing down like the burdens of our ambitions, and started along the faint trail that led into the heart of the unknown. The path was barely a suggestion, more a narrow track worn by deer and elk than anything made by human hands, winding steeply uphill through old-growth forest where the trees were giants of the earth, their trunks so thick that even if we all linked arms we couldn't encircle them, bark textured with deep furrows from centuries of growth, the overhead foliage so thick that it turned the midday sun into twilight shadows dancing on the forest floor, every step crunching on a carpet of needles and leaves that released a pungent aroma of pine and decay, heightening the sense of isolation as we pressed on. My friends led with confident strides, checking GPS devices and consulting a hand-drawn map that one of them had sketched from memory or research, pointing out landmarks with nods and whispers a distinctive rock formation that jutted like a finger from the hillside. A dead tree twisted into eerie shapes by wind or lightning. A small meadow where fresh deer droppings suggested recent activity, their familiarity with the route suggesting they had scouted it before or studied it obsessively. While I trailed behind, my pack growing heavier with each incline, doubts whispering in my mind about the wisdom of this venture into such remote territory. As we climbed higher, the forest changed in subtle ways that amplified the otherworldliness of the place, the trees becoming even more ancient and massive, some likely standing since before the arrival of Europeans on this continent. The underbrush thickening into a wall of ferns reaching to our waists and berry bushes, so dense that visibility was reduced to mere feet, forcing us to cross streams on fallen logs that wobbled under our weight, scramble over rock slides where loose stones shifted treacherously, and push through tight sections of woodland in single file, branches snagging at clothing and skin like grasping hands, my legs burning from the effort and my breath coming in ragged gasps, wondering if the destination could possibly justify this grueling journey. Yet my companions never wavered, their knowledge of the terrain allowing them to navigate without pause. The building tension like a coil tightening in my chest as we delved deeper into the unknown. After 3 hours of steady ascent, we finally reached a small clearing ringed by enormous cedar trees that towered like guardians, the site clearly used before as a campsite, with a fire ring built from rounded river stones, logs positioned as benches, and flattened areas where tents had been pitched in the past, a spot that offered a brief respite from the march. And as we set up camp, one of them began to describe the area in more detail, his voice low as if the trees might be listening, explaining that we were in a section of forest rarely seen by humans, miles from any official trail or road, owned by the logging company but left uncut for over 20 years due to the sheer difficulty of accessing it with equipment. A place where nature had reclaimed its dominion, and it was only then, as the sun dipped lower and the shadows lengthened, that they revealed the real reason for our trip, the secret they had been holding back with those knowing glances and cryptic jokes. As we sat around the fire that first night, the flames crackling and sending sparks dancing into the darkening sky, eating dinner from cans heated over the coals, and passing around a bottle of whiskey that burned warmly on the way down, the organizer started telling stories with a passion that lit his eyes brighter than the fire, describing how this area had a reputation among local hunters and loggers, not the kind that's boasted about in daylight but whispered in dim bars after too many drinks. Tales he had pieced together from old newspaper clippings, online forums dedicated to the paranormal, and interviews with retired workers who had spent their lives in these mountains, all sharing common elements of a creature that walked on 2 legs like a man but towered over any human, covered in thick dark fur, possessing strength that could bend steel and intelligence that allowed it to stay hidden from all but the most unlucky observers. The first recorded sighting in this region dated back to the 1940s, when a logging crew reported finding footprints the size of dinner plates pressed deep into the mud near their camp. Impressions that couldn't be explained by any known animal and sparked rumors that persisted through the decades, evolving into accounts of camps destroyed overnight by something with immense power. Loggers hearing calls in the forest that didn't match any bird or beast, sounds that seemed to carry intelligence and purpose. Hikers catching glimpses of something massive, watching them from the trees before vanishing without a trace. But the stories that truly captivated him came from the small communities at the forest's edge, families who had lived off the land for generations and knew the difference between a bear's lumbering gait and something far more sinister, describing how the creature would sometimes appear at the borders of their properties, standing motionless among the trunks and staring at their homes with eyes that reflected a knowing awareness, leading to strict rules where children were forbidden from playing outside after dark. Pets that wandered too far never returned, and every few years, hunters would enter the deep woods and simply disappear, their campsites found in shambles as if hit by a force of nature. Gear scattered and tents ripped apart, but no bodies to tell the tale. The most detailed and chilling narrative came from an old trapper who had encountered the creature face to face in the 1980s. While checking his trap lines, he discovered them systematically destroyed. Following the trail of wreckage to a small clearing where he found crude shelters made from interwoven branches, areas where vegetation had been gathered and sorted into piles, and what looked like tools fashioned from stone and wood. The air heavy with a smell he described as a mixture of wet animal fur and something rotting, so strong it made his eyes water and his stomach churn. As he examined one of the branch structures, he heard movement behind him and turned to see it standing there, 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur, with a face that was almost human but distorted with primitive features. They stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was likely only seconds. Then the creature let out a sound he called part roar, part scream, and part something else entirely. A noise that vibrated through his bones before it turned and disappeared into the forest with astonishing speed, leaving behind footprints 18 inches long, with clear toe marks and a depth that suggested something weighing well over 400 pounds. A sight that haunted him for the rest of his life. As my buddy recounted these stories, his voice rising with excitement, he pulled out photographs of footprint casts, copies of old newspaper articles, even a recording of the strange calls that someone had captured in the forest, playing it back on his phone with a volume that seemed to echo unnaturally through the trees. Absolutely convinced that this area was home to at least one of these creatures, and he had planned the entire trip around the possibility of an encounter, turning what I thought was a simple hunting outing into a quest for proof of the impossible, while the other 2 guys treated it more like an adventure, laughing it off, but packing extra ammunition and high-powered rifles with scopes. Gear designed for bear country, but with an edge that suggested they took the legends more seriously than they let on. The fire's glow casting flickering shadows that seemed to take on lives of their own, heightening the suspense as the night deepened. That first night, lying in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, I found myself attuned to every noise in a way I never had before. The snap of a twig could be a deer stepping delicately through the underbrush, or the careful approach of something much larger and more intelligent. The rustle of leaves might be the wind, or the subtle movement of a massive form just out of sight. Sleep evading me as my mind raced with the stories I'd heard, wondering if we had bitten off more than we could chew by coming here. The next morning, we split up to cover more ground. The plan to look for signs of deer activity, while keeping an eye out for anything unusual, spreading out in a rough line and staying within radio contact as we worked our way through a valley that showed a lot of game traffic. A familiar routine from previous hunts where we'd move slowly and quietly, stopping every few steps to listen and observe, looking for tracks, droppings, places where animals had been feeding or resting, always keeping the wind in our faces so our scent didn't carry ahead. But from the very beginning, something felt off about this forest, too quiet for comfort, with long stretches where the only sound was our own footsteps crunching through the dead leaves. The few noises we did hear seeming wrong somehow. Bird calls that stopped abruptly in the middle, as if something had startled them into silence. The crash of something large moving through the underbrush. But when we investigated, we'd find nothing there, and underneath it all, a constant feeling that we were being watched, eyes tracking our every move from the shadows. I was following what looked like a deer trail along the bottom of a ravine when I found the first unusual tracks, pressed deep into the soft earth near a small stream. Definitely not from any animal I recognized. Too big to be human, wrong shape for a bear. 5 distinct toe marks and what looked like a heel print, but sized for something much larger than should exist in these woods, calling the others over on the radio. And we spent 20 minutes examining the prints and taking photographs. They were fresh, probably made within the last day or two, the depth suggesting something incredibly heavy, and the stride length indicating legs much longer than a human's. One of the guys getting really excited talking about how this proved the creature was active in the area. But I was starting to feel nervous if something that big was wandering around the forest. Maybe we should be more careful about how we approach this whole situation. The suspense building as we realized we might not be the hunters we thought we were. We followed the trail of prints for almost a mile up out of the ravine and onto a ridge that gave us a view of the surrounding forest. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to move with purpose. The tracks didn't wander randomly like an animal searching for food. They followed efficient routes, took advantage of natural pathways, and avoided areas where it would leave obvious signs of its passage. At one point leading us to a tree that had obviously been used as a scratching post. The bark shredded from about 4 feet up to nearly 8 feet up the trunk, the gouges deep. Made by something with incredible strength and claws that could tear through wood like paper, sending a chill down my spine as I imagined the power behind those marks. But the really unsettling discovery came when we reached a small clearing on top of the ridge. Someone or something had been using this area recently. There were the remains of what might have been shelters, crude structures made from branches and bark, piles of pine cones and berries that looked like they'd been gathered and sorted, and scattered around the clearing, the bones of various animals. Most of the bones were what you'd expect to find in a forest. Deer, rabbits, squirrels, even what looked like the remains of a bear. But they'd all been cracked open in the same methodical way, as if something had been extracting the marrow, and they'd been arranged in neat piles, sorted by size and type. The smell in the clearing was overwhelming. That same mixture of wet fur and decay that the old trapper had described, but much stronger. It clung to everything, got into your nose and throat, and made it hard to breathe. We didn't stay there long. The place felt cursed, like we were intruding on a private domain. And as we were leaving the clearing, one of the guys noticed something that made us all stop in our tracks. Fresh footprints leading away from the area, heading deeper into the forest. But these prints were different from the ones we'd been following. Smaller, but still much larger than human. And there were 2 sets of them side by side. We weren't dealing with just one creature. There were at least 2 of them out there, and they were traveling together. The realization hitting us like a cold wave, amplifying the suspense as we pondered what that meant for our safety. We spent the rest of the day and most of the next one tracking the creatures through increasingly dense forest. The terrain got rougher, the undergrowth thicker, and the feeling of being watched stronger. Several times we heard sounds that might have been communication between the creatures. Low-pitched calls that carried through the trees, too organized to be random animal noises, building a sense of impending confrontation that kept us on edge. Our radios crackling with updates as we pushed on, the forest seeming to close in around us like a living entity. On the 3rd day, everything changed in a heartbeat. We'd been following a game trail along the side of a steep slope when the forest suddenly went completely silent. Not just quiet, but absolutely silent in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. Even our own footsteps seemed muffled. That's when we smelled it again. That awful mixture of wet fur and rotting meat. But much stronger than before, fresh and close. We all froze and started communicating with hand signals. One of the guys pointed uphill, indicating he thought the smell was coming from that direction. Another pointed to his ear and then toward the tree line, suggesting he could hear something moving. We spread out slightly and started moving uphill, rifles ready, trying to make as little noise as possible. The smell got stronger with each step, and underneath it, I started to pick up other scents. Something musky and animal-like, but also something else. Something that reminded me uncomfortably of a zoo or a pet store. The game trail led us to another small clearing, this one surrounded by massive pine trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The ground was covered with a thick layer of pine needles that muffled our footsteps. And standing in the center of the clearing with its back to us was the creature we'd been tracking. It was even bigger than I'd imagined. Had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe 9, with shoulders broader than any human's. Covered from head to foot in dark brown fur that looked thick and coarse like a bear's. But longer, it was doing something with its hands, manipulating objects on the ground in front of it, completely unaware of our presence. The sight freezing us in place as we dropped to the ground behind a fallen log and watched. The creature's movements were deliberate and purposeful. It would pick up objects from one pile, examine them carefully, then place them in different arrangements from our position. It looked like it was sorting stones or pieces of wood, but I couldn't tell what the purpose was. The most unsettling thing was how human-like its behavior seemed. The way it would pause to consider its work, the careful precision of its movements, even the way it occasionally scratched itself or adjusted its position. This wasn't just an animal going through instinctive behaviors. There was intelligence here, problem-solving ability that was uncomfortably familiar. We watched for maybe 10 minutes, nobody daring to move or make a sound. The creature continued its work, occasionally making soft grunting noises that might have been satisfaction or frustration. At one point, it stood up to its full height and stretched, giving us a clear view of its massive frame and the raw power contained in those limbs. That's when the guy who had organized the trip made his decision. I saw him slowly raising his rifle, bringing the scope up to his eye. The rest of us were frantically trying to signal him to stop, but he wasn't paying attention to us anymore. He had that look hunters get when they've spotted the trophy of a lifetime. That single-minded focus that blocks out everything else. The creature was maybe 60 yards away, standing in profile, completely unaware of the danger. An easy shot for someone with his experience and equipment. I heard him whisper, just barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "We'll be famous." The rifle cracked like thunder in the silence of the forest. The bullet hit the creature's center mass, spinning it around and knocking it backwards several steps. Dark blood sprayed across the pine needles, and the creature let out a roar that seemed to shake the trees themselves. But it didn't go down. Instead, it turned toward us with a speed that defied its massive size, its eyes locking onto our hiding spot with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. The wound was clearly causing it pain, but it wasn't slowing it down. If anything, it seemed to make it more dangerous. The creature charged. I've seen bears charge before, and this was nothing like that. Bears are fast, but they lumber, their bulk working against their speed. This thing moved like a predator that had been designed for exactly this kind of situation. It covered the 60 yards between us faster than should have been possible for something that size, crashing through the undergrowth like it wasn't even there. All of us were shooting now, survival instinct overriding everything else. The sound of rifle fire echoed through the forest, and the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and blood. I could see our bullets hitting the creature, dark patches spreading across its fur, but it kept coming. We had to keep moving backward as we shot, trying to maintain some distance, but the creature was gaining ground with every step, its massive strides covering more ground than our panicked retreat. I could see the rage in its eyes, the pain and fury of something that had been living peacefully until we'd invaded its territory and tried to kill it. My rifle held 5 rounds, and I emptied the magazine as fast as I could work the bolt. At least 2 of my shots hit home. I could see the impact and the creature's reaction, but it barely stumbled. The other guys were having the same experience. We were putting multiple rounds into this thing, and it was absorbing the damage like it was built to take punishment. The creature got within 20 yards before it finally started to slow down. Blood was streaming from multiple wounds. Its breathing was labored, and its movements were becoming less coordinated. But it was still coming, still determined to reach us and make us pay for what we'd done. It took 3 more direct hits before it finally went down. collapsing forward and sliding several feet through the pine needles before coming to rest against a tree. Even then, it tried to get back up, its massive chest heaving as it struggled to draw breath. We all stood there for a moment, rifles still pointed at the motionless form. Afraid to believe it was finally over, the forest had gone silent again, as if every living thing was waiting to see what would happen next. When we finally worked up the courage to approach, the reality of what we'd done hit me like a physical blow up close. The creature was even more impressive and disturbing than it had been from a distance. The sheer size of it was overwhelming. Its hands were easily twice the size of mine, with thick black nails that looked more like claws. The muscle definition visible under the matted fur suggested strength that could have torn any of us apart without effort. But it was the face that really got to me. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't animal either. The features were heavy and primitive, with a prominent brow ridge and a jaw that could obviously deliver crushing force. But there was something in the bone structure. Something about the way the features were arranged that reminded me uncomfortably of looking at myself in a mirror. The eyes were the worst part, even in death. There was an intelligence there that was deeply unsettling. This hadn't been just an animal acting on instinct. This had been a thinking, reasoning being that had been living its life peacefully until we'd shown up and murdered it. The smell coming off the body was overwhelming. That wet fur and rotting meat odor we'd been following, but concentrated and mixed with the metallic smell of fresh blood. I had to step back several times to keep from throwing up. We'd pumped at least 15 rounds into this thing from 4 different rifles. The wounds were devastating, and the amount of blood soaked into the pine needles around the body was staggering. Whatever this creature was, it had been incredibly tough and determined. A lesser animal would have gone down after the first few shots, but this thing had kept coming almost to the end. The guy who had started this whole nightmare was already pulling out his phone, talking excitedly about documentation and proof. He wanted to take pictures, get measurements, maybe even try to move the body to a better location for photography. The whole thing felt wrong to me, disrespectful and ghoulish. We had just killed something that might have been the last of its kind, and he wanted to treat it like a trophy deer. But before we could argue about it, we heard something that turned our blood to ice. From somewhere deeper in the forest came a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. It started as a low moan, almost subsonic, that I felt more than heard. Then it built into a wail of pure grief and rage. A sound that contained emotions I couldn't begin to understand. But that struck me on a primal level. It was the sound of something mourning. Something that had just discovered what we'd done to its companion. The calls seemed to go on forever, echoing off the mountainsides and reverberating through the forest. When it finally died away, it was replaced by something even worse. The sound of something large moving through the forest toward us, making no effort at stealth. Heavy footsteps getting closer, the crash of branches being pushed aside or broken, and underneath it all, a low growling that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. We could hear it coming from maybe a quarter-mile away, and it was making no effort to hide its approach. Trees were being pushed aside with casual strength, and the footsteps were so heavy they were actually shaking the ground where we stood. One of the guys started frantically reloading his rifle, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the cartridges into the magazine. The rest of us followed suit, but I could see the same realization in everyone's eyes. We'd barely managed to bring down the first creature with a surprise attack and overwhelming firepower. Now we were facing something that knew exactly where we were and was coming for revenge. Through the trees, we started catching glimpses of movement. Something even larger than the creature we'd just killed, moving with purpose and fury. Occasionally, we'd see a massive form between the tree trunks or catch a flash of dark fur in the shadows. The smell hit us next, the same wet fur and decay odor, but stronger and mixed with something else. Something that spoke of rage and violence and a predator that had moved beyond hunting for food into hunting for revenge. The creature stepped into the clearing, and I understood why the legend spoke of only one Bigfoot in any given area. This wasn't just another member of the same species. This was something bigger, older, more dangerous. The alpha of the pack maybe, or the mate of the creature we'd killed. It had to be at least 9 feet tall, broader, and more muscular than the first one. Its fur was darker, almost black, and its face showed scars from years of fighting and survival. But most terrifying of all was the intelligence in its eyes. This thing had seen what we'd done, understood exactly what had happened, and had come to make us pay for it. It looked down at the body of the first creature, and the sound it made was heartbreaking. A low, keening wail that spoke of loss and grief and a pain that went beyond the physical. Then it looked up at us, and I saw murder in those eyes. The creature charged, and this time there was no hesitation, no moment of surprise. It came at us with the focused rage of something that had nothing left to lose. We opened fire immediately, all 4 rifles speaking at once. But this creature was ready for us. It zigzagged as it ran, using the trees for cover, making itself a difficult target. Our shots were hitting. I could see the impacts and the spray of blood, but they weren't slowing it down. This thing was bigger, stronger, and smarter than the first one. It had learned from what had happened to its companion, and it wasn't going to make the same mistakes. It covered the distance between us in what felt like seconds, and suddenly we were fighting for our lives at close quarters. The creature hit us like a natural disaster. It grabbed the closest guy, the one who'd fired the first shot, and lifted him off his feet like he weighed nothing. The sound of bones breaking was audible even over our shouting and the creature's roars. The rest of us were still shooting, trying to get clear shots that wouldn't hit our friend. But the creature was using him as a shield while it systematically dismantled him. When it was done, it threw the body aside like a rag doll and turned its attention to the rest of us. I've never been so terrified in my life. This wasn't hunting anymore. Wasn't even fighting. This was pure survival. And I knew we were outmatched. The creature moved with a speed and agility that defied its massive size, and every blow it landed had the force of a sledgehammer behind it. One of the other guys tried to run and got maybe 10 steps before the creature caught him. I heard the scream cut off abruptly, and when I looked back, there was just a spreading pool of blood in the pine needles that left 2 of us, and I could see the same panic in my remaining friend's eyes that I felt in my own chest. We were going to die here, torn apart by something that had every right to hate us for what we'd done. The creatures seemed to understand that we were beaten. It stopped rushing and started stalking us instead, herding us away from our rifles and into a position where we couldn't escape. It was playing with us now, drawing out the revenge for what we'd done to its mate. When it finally came for us, my friend tried to make a stand. He'd found a heavy branch and was swinging it like a club, trying to buy us time or space or something. The creature caught the branch in one massive hand, snapped it like a toothpick, and then did to him what it had done to the others. I was alone now, facing something out of a nightmare, and I knew I had only seconds before it finished me. That's when something inside me snapped. Not courage, not heroism, just pure animal panic. Every rational thought disappeared, and I was operating on pure instinct. I threw my rifle down and ran. I crashed through the forest like a man possessed, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, roots trying to trip me with every step behind me. I could hear the creature following, but it seemed to be taking its time. Maybe it knew I couldn't escape, or maybe it wanted to savor the hunt. I ran uphill, downhill, through streams, over fallen logs, through thickets so dense I had to force my way through by sheer determination. My lungs were burning, my legs were cramping, but I couldn't stop. Every time I slowed down, I could hear those massive footsteps getting closer at some point during the chase. I realized I wasn't hearing the footsteps anymore. I stopped and listened, gasping for breath. But the forest had gone silent again. Either the creature had given up, or it was stalking me quietly now. I kept moving, but more carefully, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the clearing where my friends had died. I had no idea which direction I was going, no landmarks to guide me. Just the desperate need to get away from that place and that thing. Hours passed, the sun moved across the sky, and I began to realize just how lost I was. I'd been running in a blind panic, not paying attention to direction or terrain. I could be miles from our original campsite, or I could be going in circles in country this wild and rough. It was impossible to tell. As darkness started to fall, I finally collapsed next to a small creek. My legs simply wouldn't carry me any further, and I was so dehydrated I could barely think straight. I drank from the creek and tried to get my bearings, but everything looked the same in the fading light. That's when the reality of my situation hit me. My friends were dead, torn apart by something that shouldn't exist. I was alone in the wilderness with no supplies, no map, no way to call for help, and somewhere out there, that creature might still be looking for me. I spent the night huddled against a tree, jumping at every sound, expecting at any moment to see those glowing eyes appear in the darkness. But nothing came. Either the creature had decided I wasn't worth pursuing, or it was content to let the wilderness finish me off. I spent 3 days wandering through the forest before I found anything that looked like human civilization. 3 days of drinking from streams, eating berries that might or might not be poisonous, and sleeping fitfully in whatever shelter I could find. The first day was the worst. I kept expecting to hear those footsteps behind me, kept catching glimpses of movement in the trees that turned out to be shadows or deer. The fear was so constant and intense that I could barely function, could barely think about anything except getting away. By the second day, the immediate terror had faded into a constant state of hypervigilance. I was still scared, but now I was also dealing with hunger, thirst, and the growing realization that I might die out here. Even if the creature never found me, the forest seemed endless. Mile after mile of trees and streams and ridges that all looked exactly the same. I tried to follow watercourses, figuring they had to lead somewhere eventually, but they just wound deeper into the wilderness. On the third day, I stumbled onto what looked like an old logging road. It was overgrown and hadn't been used in years, but it was definitely man-made. I followed it for hours, and just when I was beginning to think it was another dead end, I saw something that made me cry with relief. A ranger station, small and weathered, but obviously still in use. There was a truck parked outside, and smoke coming from the chimney. The ranger who answered my knock took one look at me and immediately started asking questions. I was covered in scratches and bruises, my clothes were torn, and I probably looked like I'd been through hell, which I had. I told him about the hunting trip, about getting lost, about my friends disappearing. I didn't mention the creatures. I wasn't ready to deal with that conversation yet, and I knew how crazy it would sound. The ranger called for a search and rescue team and gave me food and water while we waited for them to arrive. The search for my friends lasted 2 weeks. Helicopters, search dogs, volunteers from local hiking clubs, even some National Guard units. They combed every square mile of forest in the area where I thought we'd been hunting. They found our original campsite with our tents still set up and most of our supplies untouched. They found traces of the trails we'd followed, including some of the footprint casts we'd made. They even found the clearing where everything had happened. There was blood there, a lot of it, bullet casings scattered around the area, trees with bullet holes and deep gouges in the bark. Clear signs that something violent had occurred, but they didn't find bodies, human or otherwise. The official report blamed a bear attack. The reasoning was that we'd encountered a grizzly panicked and started shooting in the confusion and terror. My friends had been killed and either carried off by the bear or had wandered away wounded and died. Somewhere the searchers couldn't find them. It was a neat, rational explanation that tied up all the loose ends. Except for one thing, there haven't been grizzly bears in that part of the country for over 50 years. But nobody wanted to talk about that inconvenient fact. The alternative explanations were too crazy to take seriously. So everyone went with the bear story and filed it away. That was 3 years ago, and I haven't been the same since. I can't go into the woods anymore. Can't even stand to be around trees for very long. The smell of pine needles, or the sound of branches creaking in the wind, brings it all back. That wet fur smell, the intelligence in those eyes, the sound of my friends screaming. I've tried therapy, tried medication, tried everything I can think of to deal with the memories. But nothing helps, because I know what really happened out there. And I know that telling the truth would just get me locked up in a psychiatric ward. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd left that first creature alone. If we'd just observed it from a distance and then gone home with our amazing secret. Those creatures have been living peacefully in that forest for who knows how long. Not bothering anyone, just trying to survive. We destroyed that. We violated their territory, murdered one of them in cold blood, and brought down a vengeance that cost my friends their lives. The worst part is the guilt. I ran when my friends needed me most. When we should have stuck together and fought as a team, I abandoned them and saved my own skin. I can tell myself that staying wouldn't have changed anything, that we were all going to die anyway, but I know the truth. I'm a coward who left his friends to face that nightmare alone. But lately, I've been having dreams that feel more like memories. Dreams where something is watching my house from the tree line, where I wake up to find muddy footprints on my porch that are way too big to be human, where I catch glimpses of something moving through my backyard at night. Last week, I found scratches on the side of my house. Deep gouges in the wood, siding about 8 feet off the ground, that look exactly like the marks we found on that tree in the forest. I think it found me. I think that creature tracked me down somehow, and now it's just waiting for the right moment to finish what we started. Maybe that's why I'm finally telling the story. Maybe I know I won't get another chance. If something happens to me, if I disappear like my friends did, at least someone will know the truth. We'll know that there are things out there in the deep woods that we don't understand, things that are better left alone. We thought we were hunters that day, but we were wrong. We were just another species of prey, and we learned too late that some predators hunt for reasons that have nothing to do with food. I can hear something moving around outside my house right now. As I finish writing this, heavy footsteps in the yard, stopping at each window like it's looking for a way in. The motion sensor lights keep coming on and going off, but when I look outside, I can't see anything, but I can smell it. That same wet fur and rotting fruit smell from the forest. It's here, and it remembers what I did. The scratching on the side of the house is getting louder now. More insistent. I can hear it moving from window to window, testing each one, looking for a weakness. My dog is huddled under the kitchen table, whimpering like he did during thunderstorms when he was a puppy. I've been preparing for this moment for months now. Ever since I started having the dreams, I knew it would eventually come. I've got supplies stored in the basement, multiple escape routes planned, even a go bag ready in case I need to run again. But I know I can't keep running forever. That creature tracked me across hundreds of miles of wilderness to find me here. It's not going to give up just because I change addresses again. This has to end one way or another. Maybe that's what I deserve. Maybe this is justice for what we did out there. We killed something that was just trying to live peacefully in its own territory. And now the consequences have finally caught up with me. I keep thinking about that moment in the clearing when we first saw the creature. How peaceful it looked going about its business, arranging those stones or pieces of wood in whatever pattern made sense to its alien intelligence. It wasn't hurting anyone, wasn't threatening anyone. It was just living its life in the deep forest where humans weren't supposed to go, and we destroyed that. We brought violence and death into a place that had probably known peace for centuries. All because one of us wanted to be famous, wanted to prove that legends were real. The irony is that we did prove it. Bigfoot is real. Living in the remote places where humans rarely venture, they're intelligent. They have complex social structures. They grieve for their dead, and they remember. If I had it to do over again, I'd have grabbed that rifle and pointed it away from the creature, instead of letting my friend take that first shot. I'd have convinced the others to just observe and document. To share the discovery with the world in a way that didn't require killing, but I can't change the past. I can only live with the consequences of what we did, and hope that maybe my story will convince someone else not to make the same mistakes. The scratching has stopped. The house has gone completely quiet the way the forest did right before our first encounter. That absolute silence that feels like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I can see shadows moving past the windows now. But they're wrong somehow. Too tall, too broad. Moving with that distinctive gait I remember from the clearing. It's circling the house, learning the layout, planning its approach. My phone battery is almost dead, and I need to finish this story before it's too late. If someone finds this account after I'm gone, please don't make the same mistakes we did. Don't go looking for these creatures with violence in your heart. Don't treat them like trophies to be hunted. They're people in their own way, different from us. Alien in their intelligence and motivations, but still people. They have families, communities, emotions. They feel pain and loss and rage just like we do. We proved that they exist. But we paid a terrible price for that knowledge. My friends died horribly because we couldn't leave well enough alone. Because we had to poke and prod and ultimately destroy something beautiful and ancient that should have been left in peace. If you encounter one of these creatures in the wild, consider yourself incredibly privileged. You're seeing something that most humans will never witness. Something that connects us to our own primitive past. Observe from a distance. Document carefully, but don't approach. Don't threaten, and whatever you do, don't try to harm it. They remember everything. They have their own concepts of justice, and they never, ever forgive. The smartphone was found face down in 6 inches of mud. Its cracked screen reflecting the pale morning light filtering through the Olympic Peninsula's ancient canopy. When investigators powered it on 3 weeks after Bill Morrison's disappearance, the device contained 247 photos and videos, the last 23 of which should not exist according to any known laws of nature or science. What follows is the complete documentation of those final days, pieced together from journal entries, photographic evidence, and the horrifying audio recordings that were never meant to be heard by human ears. On March 12, 2017, 28-year-old wilderness photographer Bill Morrison entered the remote forests of Washington State's Olympic Peninsula for what should have been a routine 5-day photography expedition. He never returned. 3 weeks later, searchers discovered his abandoned campsite deep within the forest, a scene of destruction that defied explanation. Among the wreckage lay his smartphone, camera equipment, and journal containing documentation of his final days that would challenge everything we thought we knew about what inhabits America's darkest wilderness. Bill Morrison had spent over a decade perfecting his craft in the most challenging wilderness areas across the Pacific Northwest. His Instagram account, followed by thousands of outdoor enthusiasts, showcased breathtaking images from locations where few humans had ever set foot. He wasn't just another weekend hiker with a camera. He was a meticulous professional who understood both the technical demands of wilderness photography and the survival skills necessary to work alone in remote environments. His equipment spoke to his expertise: professional-grade cameras capable of functioning in extreme conditions, specialized lenses for low-light forest photography, and backup systems that had kept him safe through countless solo expeditions. Bill carried emergency beacons, water purification systems, and enough survival gear to sustain himself for weeks if necessary. Those who knew his work understood that if anyone could handle whatever the mountains threw at him, it was Bill Morrison. But his final expedition would prove that even the most prepared individuals could encounter something beyond their comprehension or control. His photography portfolio revealed a man drawn to the liminal spaces of the natural world, the boundaries between known and unknown, the edges where civilization faded into primordial wilderness. His images captured fog-shrouded valleys where ancient trees emerge from mist like titans from another age, hidden waterfalls cascading into pools that reflected no sky, and forest paths that seemed to lead deeper into mystery with every step. It was this attraction to the unknown that ultimately led Bill to the Skokomish Triangle, a region that had claimed others before him and would add his name to a list of the vanished that stretched back over a century. The Olympic Peninsula has harbored dark secrets for centuries, its vast wilderness concealing mysteries that predate human memory. The region Bill chose for his final expedition was particularly notorious, an area locals called the Skokomish Triangle, roughly 40 square miles of old-growth forest where compasses spin wildly, GPS devices fail without explanation, and even experienced guides lose their way. The indigenous Skokomish people speak in hushed tones of the Sillies, massive hair-covered beings that dwell in the deepest parts of the forest. These aren't the friendly giants of modern cryptozoology, but something far more complex and potentially dangerous. Tribal stories describe them as possessing intelligence equal to or exceeding that of humans with their own social structures, territories, and ancient grudges against those who venture uninvited into their domain. The written record of strange encounters in this region stretches back to the 1890s, when early logging crews reported tools vanishing overnight, enormous footprints circling their camps, and bone-chilling howls that seemed to come from every direction at once. Loggers would arrive at work sites to find massive trees felled overnight with no tool marks, as if something with tremendous strength had simply twisted them from the ground more recently. The region has seen an unusual number of missing persons cases that share disturbing similarities. Experienced hikers enter the forest following well-marked trails only to vanish without leaving so much as a broken branch behind. Search teams find abandoned campsites showing signs of systematic destruction, personal items arranged in unnatural patterns, and massive footprints that lead deeper into the wilderness before simply ending, as if their makers had taken to the trees or dissolved into the forest itself. The terrain itself seems designed to swallow secrets whole. Dense canopy blocks out most sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight world where shadows move independently of their sources, and the normal rules of forest ecology seem suspended. Ancient lava tubes honeycomb the landscape, creating a vast underground network that has never been fully mapped. Some passages are large enough to drive trucks through, while others wind for miles through absolute darkness before emerging in hidden valleys that appear on no official maps. In some areas, the forest is so thick that rescue helicopters cannot penetrate the canopy, their rotors catching on branches that seem to reach out deliberately to entangle anything attempting to enter from above. Ground-based search teams report that radio communication fails within certain boundaries, as if the forest itself generates some form of interference that isolates anyone who ventures too deep. It was into this primordial darkness that Bill Morrison disappeared, carrying with him the cameras that would document his final days and the forces that claimed him. Bill's handwritten journal, found wrapped in plastic near his destroyed campsite, documented his expedition with characteristic professional detail until something in the forest began documenting him in return. The entries reveal a gradual shift from scientific observation to growing unease, and finally to barely controlled terror, as he realized he was no longer the hunter, but the hunted. March 12th, Day 1. Perfect conditions for the start of the expedition. Entered the forest at dawn. Following the old growth trail system deeper than I've ever gone before, the trees here are ancient. Some of these giants have been standing since before European contact with the Pacific Northwest. Photographed several rare lichen species and what might be evidence of Roosevelt elk activity, though the tracks are unusually large and spaced far apart. The forest has an almost cathedral-like quality, silent and reverent. Light filters down through the canopy in distinct shafts, creating natural spotlights that move across the forest floor as the day progresses. The air itself feels different here, heavier, more oxygen, as if I'm breathing the exhalations of trees that have been photosynthesizing for centuries. Set up camp near a small creek that runs clear and cold from some underground source. The sound of running water is the only noise that penetrates the forest silence, everything proceeding as planned. Though I'm already feeling the peculiar isolation that comes with being this far from any human presence. The nearest road is over 15 miles away, and the trail I followed to get here is barely visible. More of a deer path than anything maintained by the Forest Service. March 13th, Day 2. Pushed further into uncharted territory today. Following game trails that seem to lead toward the heart of the forest, GPS signal is sporadic under this canopy. Feels like being cut off from the modern world entirely. The satellite photos I studied before this trip don't do justice to how dense this forest actually is. From above, it must look like a solid green carpet, but from inside, it's a complex three-dimensional maze of trunks, branches, and undergrowth. Found some fascinating geological formations that look like they might be cave entrances carved into limestone outcroppings. The stone is weathered in unusual patterns, almost like it's been worked by intelligent hands rather than natural erosion. Made note of several locations to investigate further if time permits. The forest is unusually quiet, more so than any wilderness area I've worked in before. In all my years of wilderness photography, I've never experienced such complete silence. No bird calls, no insect noise. Even the wind seems muted by the dense canopy above. It's beautiful, but deeply unsettling, like nature itself is holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. Made camp in a clearing surrounded by massive Douglas firs, some of which must be over 400 years old. The silence here is so complete, I can hear my own heartbeat. The sound of blood moving through my ears. There's something almost prehistoric about this place. Like I've stepped back in time to when the world was younger and stranger, when different rules governed what was possible in the natural world. March 14th, Day 3. Something is definitely wrong with this place. Last night, I heard sounds that don't belong to any animal I know. Deep, resonant calls echoing through the forest from multiple directions. The vocalizations seemed almost conversational in nature, as if multiple large animals were communicating with each other across great distances. The sounds would start from one direction, then be answered from another, then another, creating a triangle of communication that seemed to surround my campsite. The calls themselves defied easy description, too deep and powerful to be human, too structured and purposeful to be random animal noise. There was something almost linguistic about the patterns, rising and falling tones that suggested meaning, emphasis, even what might have been emotional content. Whatever was making those sounds possessed intelligence, and they were definitely aware of my presence. This morning, I found tracks near the creek that have shaken me more than I care to admit. Massive prints, clearly bipedal, but impossibly large and deep. Each footprint is nearly 18 inches long and 7 inches wide, pressed deep enough into the muddy bank to suggest something large bipedal creatures covered in hair. The artwork spans what must be centuries, showing different artistic styles and levels of skill that suggest multiple generations of artists working in the same location. Some images appear ancient, painted in earth tones, with techniques that predate known Pacific Northwest artistic traditions. Others look more recent, incorporating details that suggest contact with modern humans. The subject matter is consistent throughout: tall, powerfully built creatures with human-like intelligence, but clearly non-human anatomy. Some paintings show peaceful interactions, the creatures and humans sharing food, working together to build structures, even what appear to be ceremonial or ritual gatherings. But others depict something darker: scenes of pursuit, capture, and what might be ritualistic behavior involving human figures being led away into cave systems. I've documented everything with photographs and video, though I'm beginning to feel like I'm no longer the one doing the observing. Found fresh tracks circling my campsite this morning. They walked around my tent while I slept, studying me just as I've been studying the evidence they've left behind. The realization that I've been under surveillance is both thrilling and terrifying. March 16th, Day 5, Final Entry. They know I'm here, and they've decided to make contact. Last night marked a turning point in whatever relationship has been developing between us over these past few days. Around midnight, something large began moving through the forest around my campsite. I could hear branches snapping under enormous weight. Heavy footsteps that seemed to shake the very ground beneath my tent. The sounds weren't random or panicked like a frightened animal would make. These movements were deliberate, purposeful, calculated. Whatever was out there was taking its time, circling my camp in a pattern that suggested reconnaissance or evaluation. For over 3 hours, heavy footsteps moved around my perimeter, always staying just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. The vocalizations started around 2 a.m., those same deep, resonant calls I'd heard before, but much closer now and clearly directed at me. The sounds seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, suggesting several large creatures coordinating their movements. There was something distinctly conversational about the exchanges, as if they were discussing me, debating what to do about the intruder in their territory. Around 4 a.m., the sounds stopped completely. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the noise had been. I lay in my tent, hardly daring to breathe, aware that something massive was standing just outside my shelter. I could hear breathing, deep, powerful respirations that seemed to come from directly above my tent, as if something tall enough was leaning over my entire campsite. When dawn finally came, I discovered that my gear had been disturbed during the night. Nothing was taken or damaged, but everything had been examined with what could only be described as scientific curiosity. My backpack had been moved and carefully opened. Food containers were removed, inspected with what seemed like delicate precision, then replaced exactly where they had been. Camera equipment was repositioned, but not damaged. Even my journal had been moved, opened to the current page, then carefully closed and returned to its original position. This wasn't random animal behavior driven by hunger or territorial aggression. There was intelligence behind every action, curiosity, and purpose that suggested these creatures possess cognitive abilities that might rival or exceed human intelligence. They were studying me just as I had been studying them, but with advantages I couldn't hope to match. I should pack up and leave immediately. Every rational part of my mind is screaming at me to get out of this forest as quickly as possible. But I'm so close to documenting something extraordinary that I can't bring myself to retreat. Now, this could be the discovery that changes everything we think we know about what shares our planet. I've set up my cameras in multiple locations around the expanded campsite, including night vision equipment and motion sensors. If these creatures decide to make another approach, I'll have documentation that the scientific community can't ignore. The batteries should last for at least 48 hours of continuous recording. The sun is setting now, and I can already hear them calling to each other in the distance. There are more voices tonight than there were last night. Many more. It sounds like they're gathering, converging on this location from throughout the forest. I don't know what they're planning, but I intend to document every moment of whatever happens next. If someone finds this journal, Know that I went into whatever comes next willingly. The fear is overwhelming, but so is the excitement of being present for something that may never happen again in human history. I've lived my entire adult life documenting the natural world, but tonight, I may witness something that transcends nature as we understand it. They're getting closer now. I can see shapes moving between the trees. Massive forms that blend with the shadows until they choose to reveal themselves. In a few minutes, I'll either have the most important wildlife documentation ever recorded, or these will be the last words I ever write. The largest one is standing at the edge of my campsite now. Just beyond the firelight, its eyes reflect the flames like burnished copper, and there's an intelligence there that's both alien and familiar. It's waiting for something, a signal, a decision. A moment when the fear and wonder balance out into something approaching communication. I'm going to approach it. God, help me. I'm going to try to make contact. The journal entries ended there, ink trailing off mid-sentence as if Bill's hand had been interrupted while writing. But his cameras had continued recording, capturing what happened after he set down his pen for the final time. The images recovered from Bill's multiple camera systems painted a chronological picture of his final days that grew increasingly disturbing as the sequence progressed. His professional equipment had continued operating even after his disappearance. Motion sensors triggering photographs and video recordings that documented events no human eyes had witnessed. The early images were exactly what one would expect from Bill's established body of work. Masterful wilderness photography showcasing the Olympic Peninsula's haunting beauty. Shafts of sunlight penetrating the forest canopy. Ancient trees whose trunks disappeared into misty heights. Delicate ferns unfurling in the perpetual twilight of the forest floor. These photographs demonstrated the technical skill and artistic eye that had made Bill's reputation in the outdoor photography community. But careful examination of even these innocent early images revealed subtle anomalies that became more pronounced as the timeline progressed. In several landscape shots, dark shapes lurked at the very edges of the frame, forms that could have been shadows or tree trunks, but which displayed a vertical symmetry and proportional consistency that suggested something else entirely. The first clearly anomalous image appeared to be a standard forest scene. Towering Douglas firs, filtered sunlight, a carpet of ancient ferns extending into the misty distance. But detailed examination revealed a dark bipedal silhouette, partially obscured by vegetation in the middle distance. The figure stood motionless among the trees, its posture suggesting it had been observing Bill for some time before he noticed its presence and raised his camera. The creature's positioning was deliberate, close enough to be photographed, but far enough away that details remained frustratingly unclear. It stood upright, with perfect balance on what appeared to be a steep slope that would challenge most humans, suggesting both exceptional strength and intimate familiarity with the challenging forest terrain. Subsequent photographs documented the watchers becoming progressively bolder as days passed. One image captured two large, dark figures on what appeared to be a game trail walking upright with a distinctive, unnaturally fluid gait that looked nothing like human locomotion. Their proportions were disturbing, too tall, too broad through the shoulders and chest, with arms that seemed to hang almost to their knees. They moved through the dense understory with an ease that suggested these creatures had traveled these paths for generations. The image quality was remarkable, despite the challenging lighting conditions. Bill's professional equipment capturing details that revealed just how non-human these beings truly were. Their hair appeared coarse and thick, covering their entire visible bodies except for the palms of their hands and what could be seen of their faces. Their posture, while upright, retained something primitive, a forward lean, that suggested tremendous power in the shoulders and arms, combined with a grace of movement that spoke to perfect adaptation to their forest environment. As the photographic sequence continued, the creatures appeared less concerned with concealment and more focused on active observation of their human visitor. One photograph showed a massive form standing at the very edge of Bill's campsite, its bulk dwarfing the surrounding vegetation. The creature's face was partially visible in profile, revealing features that combined human and primitive characteristics in deeply unsettling ways. The skull showed the heavy brow ridge and pronounced jaw structure associated with great physical power. But the eye placement and what could be seen of the cranial development suggested intelligence that was unmistakably aware and calculating. The creature wasn't simply looking at Bill's camp. It was studying it, evaluating the equipment, the layout, the potential threats and opportunities presented by this human intrusion into its territory. But it was the final series of images that provided the most complete and disturbing documentation of Bill's encounter with whatever inhabited the deepest parts of the Olympic Peninsula's wilderness. These photographs revealed what appeared to be a complex social group. Multiple creatures of varying sizes and apparent ages gathering at the perimeter of Bill's expanded campsite. The largest figure stood nearly 10 feet tall, its massive frame covered in dark, coarse hair that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the available light. The creature's proportions suggested incredible physical power, shoulders that would dwarf the strongest human athletes, arms with reach that could span distances no human could manage, and a barrel chest that spoke to respiratory capacity adapted for activities requiring tremendous exertion. Smaller figures clustered nearby, displaying similar anatomical features, but with proportions that suggested either juveniles or sexual dimorphism within the species. Some stood nearly as tall as the largest figure, but with more graceful builds. Others were clearly much younger, showing the same basic body plan, but at perhaps 2/3 the size of the adults. Most remarkable was the evidence of social structure and communication visible in the photographs. The creatures weren't simply gathering randomly. They maintained specific spatial relationships that suggested hierarchy, deference, and coordinated behavior. The largest figure consistently positioned itself between the smaller ones and Bill's campsite, clearly serving as both leader and protector. Several images captured moments of apparent communication between the creatures. Their postures, gestures, and positioning relative to each other displayed the kind of complex social signaling associated with high intelligence. These weren't simple animals operating on instinct. They were thinking beings capable of planning, discussion, and coordinated action. Most unsettling was their apparent familiarity with human technology and behavior. Rather than showing fear or confusion when confronted with Bill's cameras and equipment, they displayed curiosity and what appeared to be understanding. One image showed the largest creature reaching toward one of Bill's motion-activated cameras, its massive hand clearly visible as it approached the device with obvious intelligence about its function and purpose. The hand itself was a study in evolutionary impossibility, clearly derived from the same basic structure as human hands, but scaled up and modified for tremendous gripping power. The fingers were proportionally longer than human digits, with what appeared to be much more robust musculature and joint structure. The palm showed the kind of callousing and development that came from a lifetime of gripping tree branches and rocky surfaces with forces that would shatter human bones. Several photographs captured the creature's remarkable adaptation to their forest environment. Images showed them moving through dense vegetation with perfect silence, their bodies flowing around obstacles like water around stones. They demonstrated the ability to climb with stunning agility, ascending massive tree trunks with no visible effort and moving through the canopy in ways that suggested they were as comfortable dozens of feet above the ground as they were on the forest floor. One particularly clear image showed a medium-sized creature, possibly a female or subadult male, suspended horizontally from a thick branch, perhaps 30 feet above Bill's campsite. The creature was observing the human activity below with obvious intelligence, its position chosen to provide optimal viewing while remaining concealed from ground-based observation. The strength required to maintain such a position for extended periods would be phenomenal. Yet the creature appeared completely relaxed and comfortable. The final photographs in the sequence were taken from Bill's handheld camera and showed a dramatically different perspective. Low-angle shots suggesting Bill was no longer standing when the images were captured. These pictures documented the creature's final approach, showing massive forms looming directly overhead, backlit by dawn light filtering through the forest canopy. The last clear image in the sequence showed the largest creature's face in remarkable detail. Captured from perhaps 6 feet away, the features were undeniably intelligent. Deep-set eyes that held awareness and what might even have been compassion. A broad nose adapted for processing the complex scent information of the deep forest, and a mouth that suggested both tremendous bite force and the capability for complex vocalizations. But it was the expression in those eyes that proved most haunting, an intelligence that seemed both alien and familiar, ancient and immediate. There was no malice in that gaze, but also no doubt about the outcome of this encounter. The creature was looking at Bill with something that might have been regret, as if it understood the human's fear, but knew that events had progressed beyond the point where retreat was possible. The final image in the camera's memory was motion blurred and overexposed, but clearly showed massive hands reaching toward the lens. Then the camera's memory card ran out of space, ending the photographic record of Bill Morrison's encounter with the unknown inhabitants of the Olympic Peninsula's deepest wilderness, following the GPS waypoints embedded in Bill's photographs. Investigators located the limestone caves he had documented in his journal entries. What they found inside was a gallery of impossible art that seemed to chronicle centuries of interaction between human and non-human intelligences in the Pacific Northwest wilderness. The cave system extended much further than Bill's initial exploration had revealed. Multiple chambers connected by passages that required crawling in some places, and opened into cathedral-like spaces in others. The limestone walls had been carved by millennia of water action, creating smooth surfaces that provided ideal canvases for artistic expression. The paintings covered nearly every available surface across multiple chambers, depicting what appeared to be an ongoing and complex relationship between humans and large hair-covered bipedal creatures. The artistic techniques varied significantly throughout the gallery, suggesting the work had been created over extended periods by multiple artists with different skill levels and cultural backgrounds. The oldest paintings located in the deepest chambers showed the most primitive artistic style, but also the most detailed anatomical knowledge of the creatures they depicted. These ancient images were painted in earth tones derived from the local minerals and plant materials, using techniques that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to create permanent artwork on limestone surfaces. These early paintings focused primarily on the creatures themselves, showing them in various activities that revealed their social structure and relationship with the forest environment. Family groups were depicted gathering food, caring for young, and constructing the tree structures that Bill had encountered in the forest. The level of anatomical detail suggested the artists had observed their subjects closely over extended periods, documenting everything from muscle definition to facial expressions with naturalistic precision. One chamber contained what appeared to be a complete catalogue of the creature's social hierarchy. Multiple figures were shown in poses that clearly indicated relative status and roles within their community. The largest figures consistently appeared in protective or leadership positions, while smaller ones were shown in various activities that suggested specialized functions. Some appear to be foragers, others seem to be responsible for construction and maintenance of forest structures, and still others appeared to serve as scouts or sentries. Most fascinating were the paintings that documented the creature's remarkable intelligence and problem-solving abilities. Several images show them using tools, not simple sticks or stones, but carefully modified implements designed for specific purposes. One painting depicted a creature using what appeared to be a lever system to move massive stones, while another showed the construction of complex shelters that required understanding of structural engineering principles. The middle period of artwork showed the first depictions of human-creature interactions. These paintings documented what appeared to be initial contact between the species, showing encounters that range from curious observation to active cooperation. Some images depicted humans and creatures working together on construction projects, sharing food, and even engaging in what might have been trade relationships. Several paintings showed humans being taught by the creatures, scenes where the larger beings appeared to be demonstrating forest survival techniques, showing humans how to find food, construct shelters, and navigate through the wilderness. The humans in these images were clearly not modern people, but appear to represent indigenous populations with technology and clothing consistent with pre-contact Pacific Northwest cultures. But not all the interaction scenes were positive. Other chambers contained darker imagery that suggested conflict and predation. Some paintings showed humans fleeing from pursuing creatures, while others depicted what could only be described as capture scenes where humans were being carried away into the forest depths. These images were painted with emotional intensity that suggested the artists had either witnessed such events or participated in them. Most disturbing were the paintings that seemed to depict ritualistic behavior involving captured humans. These images were concentrated in a single chamber whose walls showed humans in various states of distress, while being observed by groups of creatures arranged in ceremonial formations. The exact meaning of these scenes remained unclear, but they suggested that the relationship between the species was far more complex and potentially dangerous than the cooperative images might suggest. The most recent additions to the gallery show clear evidence of contact with modern humans. These paintings, created with materials that included what appeared to be commercial pigments, depicted humans with recognizable modern equipment: backpacks, cameras, GPS devices, and other contemporary gear. The artistic style had evolved as well, showing influence from European artistic traditions that suggested the unknown artists had somehow gained exposure to modern artistic techniques. These modern paintings maintained the documentary focus of the earlier work, but with subjects that were clearly contemporary. Multiple images showed hikers, photographers, and campers being observed by the creatures from concealment. The level of detail in depicting modern equipment was remarkable, suggesting the artists had not only observed these items, but understood their functions. Most chilling were the modern paintings that seemed to document the fate of various missing persons over recent decades. Image after image showed humans being led away from their campsites, guided or carried by the creatures deeper into cave systems that extended far beyond the decorated chambers. In every case, the human figures showed expressions of fear and confusion, while the creatures appeared calm and purposeful. One recent painting appeared to show Bill himself, identifiable by his distinctive camera equipment and backpack design. The image depicted him standing at the edge of his campsite while massive figures approached from the surrounding forest. The painting captured his final moments of human agency with disturbing accuracy, showing his expression of wonder mixed with terror as he realized the magnitude of what he was encountering. The final chamber contained the most recent artwork, paintings that appear to have been created within days or weeks of Bill's disappearance. These images showed the same scene from multiple perspectives: a human figure being carried away into the depths of the cave system by creatures who move through the underground passages with obvious familiarity. But most unsettling was the final painting in the sequence, an image that showed the same human figure but changed. The person in this painting appeared calm rather than terrified, standing upright and unrestrained among a group of the creatures. The figure's posture suggested acceptance rather than captivity, as if whatever process had begun with fear and resistance had reached some form of resolution. The implications were disturbing beyond measure. Either the paintings depicted some form of adaptation or conditioning that allowed humans to survive among the creatures. or they documented something far worse. A complete loss of human identity that reduced missing persons to something less than what they had been. The investigation into Bill Morrison's disappearance became one of the most extensive wilderness searches in Olympic Peninsula history. Yet it yielded more questions than answers. For 6 months, following the discovery of his campsite, teams of searchers combed through hundreds of square miles of dense forest, employing tracking dogs, helicopter surveys, and ground teams of experienced wilderness rescue specialists. The search efforts revealed disturbing patterns that extended far beyond Bill's individual case. Within a 20-mile radius of his final campsite, investigators discovered evidence of at least 7 other abandoned camps dating back over the past 15 years. Each site showed similar characteristics: systematic destruction of equipment, personal items arranged in unnatural patterns, and the same massive footprints leading away into the deepest parts of the forest. The tracking dogs brought in to follow Bill's scent exhibited behavior that their handlers had never encountered in decades of search and rescue work. The animals would follow normal human scent trails to the edge of Bill's campsite, then refuse to continue further. Several dogs displayed signs of extreme agitation when directed toward the tracks leading away from the camp, whimpering and backing away as if sensing some predator presence that their human handlers couldn't detect. Most experienced trackers eventually refused to follow the creature trails beyond a certain point. The massive footprints led through terrain that became increasingly impossible for humans to navigate, up sheer rock faces that would require climbing equipment, through thorny undergrowth so dense that passage would shred clothing and skin, and into cave systems that extended deep underground with no obvious exits. Search teams equipped with rappelling gear attempted to follow some of the underground passages, but found that the cave systems extended much further than their equipment could safely reach. Emergency radios failed to maintain contact once teams moved more than a few hundred feet into the tunnels, and several searchers reported an overwhelming sense of being watched by unseen observers in the darkness. The investigation took on an increasingly surreal quality as evidence accumulated that seemed to defy rational explanation. Trail cameras placed throughout the search area captured images of the creatures on dozens of occasions, but the beings seemed aware of the camera placements and would often approach to examine the devices before continuing on their way. In several instances, cameras were found repositioned to face different directions, as if the creatures were deliberately redirecting the surveillance equipment. Ground teams reported finding tree structures identical to those Bill had documented, but discovered that these constructions appeared and disappeared with disturbing frequency. Shelters that had been photographed and GPS marked would be gone when teams returned the next day, while new constructions would appear in different locations overnight. The implications were deeply unsettling. Either the creatures were actively managing their territorial markers in response to human search activities, or they possessed the ability to construct and deconstruct massive wooden frameworks with impossible speed. Evidence of the creature's intelligence became increasingly apparent as the search progressed. Search teams began finding their own equipment moved or examined during overnight camps. Nothing was ever taken or damaged, but personal items would be found carefully arranged in patterns that suggested they had been studied by entities trying to understand human technology and behavior. Most disturbing were the signs that the creatures were actively monitoring and perhaps influencing the search efforts. Teams would arrive at predetermined search coordinates to find that obvious clues had been removed or obscured, while new evidence would appear in areas that had been thoroughly searched the previous day. The pattern suggested that the beings responsible for Bill's disappearance were aware of human search protocols and were systematically staying one step ahead of the investigation. Several search team members reported encounters that they were initially reluctant to describe officially. These sightings involved glimpses of massive hair-covered figures observing search activities from distant ridgelines or tree lines. The creatures never approached close enough for detailed observation, but their presence was unmistakable to anyone who caught sight of them. What made these encounters most unsettling was the clear intelligence behind the creatures' behavior. They positioned themselves where they could observe human activities while remaining at safe distances, displaying tactical awareness that suggested sophisticated understanding of human capabilities and limitations. The official search was suspended after 6 months, when it became clear that conventional search and rescue techniques were inadequate for the terrain and circumstances involved. The final report listed Bill Morrison as missing under unknown circumstances, though the investigating officers privately acknowledged that the evidence pointed toward some form of animal involvement. Animal involvement of a type that had no precedent in official wildlife documentation, unofficially. The search efforts revealed evidence of a hidden ecosystem, operating parallel to the known wildlife populations of the Olympic Peninsula. The massive footprints found throughout the search area suggested a breeding population of unknown primates that had somehow remained undetected by mainstream biology. The sophistication of their tool use and construction techniques indicated intelligence levels that challenged assumptions about human uniqueness in the natural world. Most troubling was the accumulating evidence that these creatures had been interacting with humans for far longer than anyone had realized. Investigation into historical missing persons cases in the region revealed patterns stretching back over a century. Experienced woodsmen, hunters, and hikers who had vanished without trace in areas where the creature sign was most concentrated. Local indigenous communities, when approached carefully and respectfully, acknowledged awareness of the forest beings, but were reluctant to discuss details with outside investigators. Their oral traditions spoke of protocols for safe interaction with the forest people, but these protocols were considered sacred knowledge, not to be shared with those who lacked proper cultural context and preparation. The investigation also revealed evidence of possible government awareness of the creatures dating back several decades. Heavily redacted documents obtained through persistent research showed that various federal agencies had investigated unusual wildlife reports in the Olympic Peninsula, but the details of their findings remained classified. The pattern of official silence suggested that knowledge of the creatures existed at higher levels of government, but was being actively suppressed to prevent public panic or ecological disruption. Private investigators hired by Bill's family continued searching long after the official efforts ended, but found themselves dealing with the same impossible circumstances that had stymied the initial search teams. The creatures seemed capable of existing within the forest ecosystem without leaving the kind of consistent sign that would allow systematic tracking. They appeared to possess not only physical capabilities far exceeding human norms, but also intelligence sufficient to understand and counter human search methodologies. The investigation ultimately raised more questions than it answered about what inhabited the deepest parts of the Olympic Peninsula's wilderness. Bill Morrison had ventured into a region where different rules applied, where intelligence existed in forms that mainstream science refused to acknowledge, and where the line between natural and supernatural became increasingly meaningless. His disappearance served as a reminder that vast areas of North American wilderness remained essentially unexplored, not because of geographical inaccessibility, but because they were actively defended by intelligences that predated human presence on the continent. The forest had claimed another victim, but Bill's documentation ensured that his fate would not be forgotten and that others would be warned about the risks of venturing too deep into places where humanity was neither welcome nor dominant. For more interesting stories, check this out.